Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous. In this video, we will be exploring how to modify input parameters in vRealize Orchestrator. The short version of this is you can't do that. vRealize Orchestrator, for reasons we're going to talk about, vRealize Orchestrator does not allow you to modify input parameters. So either this is going to be the shortest video I've ever created, or we've got some investigating to do. So let's continue onwards. Now, in this particular video, I'm going to take us through a quick review of input parameters, output parameters, and attributes, along with inward binding and outward binding. Then, after that, we'll take a look at why it's not possible to modify input parameters. But we won't leave it there. There are some techniques that you can use to enable you to do what you're trying to do. Strictly speaking, you're not modifying input parameters, but it's going to be as if you are. So let's move onwards and see what we've got here. Now again, quick reminder here, in vRealize Orchestrator, you need to perform something known as parameter binding, or sometimes called variable binding. That involves explicitly setting up bindings to input parameters, output parameters, and or attributes. Those bindings can either be inward bindings or outward bindings. With an inward binding, that's going to enable us to read the value that's stored in a variable, which means we'll be able to execute code like this. So for instance, system.log myvar, in order for us to be able to execute that code, Orchestrator needs to be able to read what's inside the variable called myvar. And in order to be able to do that, we're going to need an inward binding. With outward bindings, those enable us to change the value that's stored by a variable. In other words, we're going to write out a new value to the variable itself. That enables us to execute code such as the code you see here. So whenever you say variable name equals something, whatever the expression may be on the right side of the equal sign, if you say variable name equals something, you're attempting to assign a new value to that variable. And in order for that assignment to stick and to persist, we need to make certain that we have an outward binding. So again, there are inward binding and outward binding. So if you followed that, give you an opportunity here for a quick little pop quiz to test your own understanding. Take a look at the code on the screen here and ask yourself, what kind of binding would you need? Go ahead and pause the video if you'd like to think about this code here, and when you're done, resume the video. Well, admittedly, that was a little bit of a tricky question because the answer is you actually need two bindings in this case. You need an inward binding to the variable called myvar, because in order to be able to add 1 to the existing value in myvar, we need to know what's in myvar. What is the value that's stored in myvar? That would require an inward binding. But that's not the only thing we're doing with myvar in this example. As you can see over on the other side of this expression, we're also attempting to assign the value, a new value to myvar. And that, as we saw in the previous slide, would require that we have an outward binding. So for this particular code to work, we would need to have both an inward binding and an outward binding. Okay, now that we remember the difference between an inward binding and an outward binding, let's take a look at what's actually going on when you do these parameter bindings. So as you can see in this screenshot here, we have a very simple workflow. It has 5 different schema elements, a start and an end, and then in between we have the 3 schema elements that we're more likely to be interested in. I've called them E1, E2, and E3. Now those 3 schema elements could be scriptable tasks or other types of schema elements, but for our purposes, let's just assume that E1, E2, and E3 are scriptable tasks. Now what happens when you do variable binding is you create a connection between variables in your workflow with variables inside of these schema elements. Now we'll refer to the variables inside your schema elements, we'll refer to those as local variables. So in our workflow, we may have input parameters, output parameters, and attributes but none of those input parameters, output parameters, and attributes are visible inside of the schema elements until we set up our parameter binding. So imagine, if you will, in our workflow, we have a pair of input parameters called IN1 and IN2. Now, when we first start out and create those input parameters are completely invisible to all of the schema elements. No schema elements can see what's in those two input parameters. No schema element could change what's in those parameters. None of the schema elements know about those two input parameters. So by setting up parameter binding, what we're doing is explicitly creating a connection between an existing variable, such as an input parameter, output parameter, or attribute. In this example here, let's assume we're trying to set up an explicit connection between the input parameter called IN1 and the schema element called E1. Now in this particular case, I know those both have the number 1 in them. IN1 and E1 both have the number 1, but there's nothing that says that the input parameter IN1 has to be bound to E1. In fact, IN1 could be bound to any or all of these schema elements. But for our purposes here, we're illustrating with this red arrow an inward binding from the input parameter called IN1 to the schema element called E1. Now, to be even more specific, the binding isn't between the input parameter and the schema element. Conceptually, you can think of it that way, but the reality is it's a binding between that input parameter and a local variable inside of E1. Now, in many cases, the name of your input parameter and the name of the local variable inside of E1 could have the exact same name, but there's nothing that says that the names have to match. By default, they tend to match, but they don't have to match in names. So as we continue onwards here, let's advance a little bit here and notice that just to illustrate the point, here I'm illustrating a binding, specifically an inward binding from the input parameter called IN2 to some variable inside of schema element E3. Again, there's no need for the numbers of the variables and the numbers of these schema elements to match at all. So now we can see that if we set up inward bindings from our input parameters into these different schema elements, specifically into some variable in the schema elements, then we'll be able to access the value of our input parameters from within those schema elements, provided we use the local variables that we set up in the binding. Now, in addition to input parameters, your workflow is quite likely going to have one or more output parameters. And in order for us to change the value of that output parameter, once again, we'd need some binding, because E1, E2, E3, none of those schema elements knows anything about the output parameter called out1. We would have to set up an outward binding. Now, in the case of input parameters and output parameters, you can only do one type of binding for each of those. With input parameters, you can only do inward bindings. And with output parameters, as the name suggests, you can only do outward binding. And while we're talking nitpicky here, another thing to know about input parameters and output parameters is input parameters are read-only variables and output parameters are write-only variables. On the other hand, we have another type of workflow variable called attributes. For instance, in this example here, let's imagine we had an attribute called attr1. Now, unlike input parameters and output parameters that are limited in terms of the type of bindings that you can do, with attributes, we could create a binding from our attribute to a local variable in a schema element, such as we've illustrated here with this latest red arrow. In this case here, this is an inward binding, but with attributes, you can also create outward bindings. So, unlike input parameters and output parameters, which can only have either inward binding or outward binding, with attributes, you can do binding in either direction. And furthermore, unlike input parameters and output parameters, which are read-only and write-only respectively, attributes are read-write variables. And that read-write capability is going to be super important to what we're striving to do here shortly. Join me in the next video where we'll explore why it's not possible to modify input parameters in vRO.